The lost city of Atlantis, the possibility of aliens in ancient Egypt, and the Trojan War are all ancient mysteries that we all know and love. But in this video, we're gonna dive a little deeper. From things like lost labyrinths to perfectly mummified bodies to cryptid giraffe creatures from prehistoric times, we've got a little bit of everything, so let's jump into it right now. Let's kick this thing off with Dara's footprints. Dara's footprints refers to a set of 4 giant footsteps at the entrance of the Dara temple in Syria. The footprints measure about 3 feet in length and 30 foot apart in stride, so you know what everybody's thinking, right? Giants. Based on that foot size and stride, it's estimated that whatever made these footprints were 65 feet tall, so yeah, a giant. Okay, so for a little bit of background, the Dara temple was built in about 1300 BC, which is even before Solomon's very first temple. It was built by the ancient Hittites out of limestone and basalt blocks, and it had tons of figures carved into each stone. It had geometric shapes carved into it, it had lines and sphinxes, and it even had some fully carved animals out of these blocks. Now this temple was probably dedicated to the worship of the goddess Ishtar, but it could have been dedicated to the storm god Baal Hadad. Anyway, the footprints at the entrance to the temple were actually carved into the temple, so they weren't actual like molded footprints, but they were obviously inspired by something. I'm really sad that it's not like an ancient god or an ancient actual giant that stepped there and made the imprint in that stone forever, but nonetheless, it's still cool. What it does do is give credence to the idea that these ancient Hittites actually saw giants, so that's what inspired them to carve giant footprints that were like proportionally accurate. Dogu is the name of a group of clay figurines that were carved in ancient Japan that seemingly symbolize pregnant women. Now they were made exclusively during the Jomon period of Japan, which took place from 14,000 BC all the way up to 400 BC, so that really doesn't help much. Now the designs of all these Dogu are very different from each other, but you can see over the years they become more and more human-like. And you can definitely track it over the years because there's a massive sample size to pull from. There were like 15 to 20,000 of these things uncovered in Japan. Now there are basically 4 styles that have been found: heart-shaped, horned owl type, goggle-eyed, and the pregnant women type. So not all of these represent pregnant women like I said, but a lot of them do. Now this pregnant type was actually said to be present in like labor, like in childbirth. It was symbolically aided in childbirth, apparently. I don't know how that works, but anyway, it was kept around the rest of the time to symbolize fertility. This makes a little more sense than you would originally think. Now here's a fun fact for you. Most of these Dogu are found broken, and it looks like they were intentionally broken, like somebody took them and just snapped them. Speculators think they might have been used as something similar to a voodoo doll. The Dogu was created in the likeness of a person, and their illnesses were transferred over to that doll. The creator of the Dogu snapped it in half, broke it, whatever, so they could banish their illness or whatever that was plaguing them. Now this theory doesn't really fit with the pregnant women type, because if you snap a pregnant woman figurine, you're gonna, well, you know what's gonna happen. Anyway, another theory is that they were used in religious rituals. They would have been like mini idols that the people worshiped during their rituals, but yet again, I'm not really sure how that ritual of breaking them fits into that. Just really quick, thank you a ton for watching. If you're enjoying this video, hit that subscribe button. It helps me out a lot. And now, let's get back into it. The Nebra Sky Disk is a bronze disc inlaid with gold that represents a map of the stars. It's actually a huge debate as to whether it was created during the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, but it's a really cool representation of the cosmos either way. It has a bronze base that's about 12 inches in diameter, and its gold on it represents either the sun or the full moon, the crescent moon, and a bunch of stars. There's even a group of 7 stars that probably represent the Pleiades, and Lord knows we've talked about the Pleiades plenty on this channel. Now besides the celestial bodies represented on the sphere, there's also golden arcs on either side of the bronze base, and also one on the bottom. The bottom arc is highly debated because nobody really knows if it's like a solar boat, if it's a rainbow, if it's a sickle. People really don't know. There's no consensus on this, and that's pretty much been the story of it since its discovery. And this discovery in itself is a whole story. In 1999, 2 guys were illegally searching a hillside in Germany, and they found it with metal detectors. They bent it up and basically totally wrecked the thing whenever they were digging it up, but they eventually sold it with a bunch of different artifacts that they dug up for a bunch of money on the black market. Since they found this stuff when they were digging on a hill in Nebra, Germany, and it was public land that's actually belonged to the German government. All these artifacts they dug up was German state property. But these people didn't want to give it to the German state. They wanted their money, so they sold it on the black market. It sold a few more times on this same black market until the German police ran a sting operation to gather all these artifacts up. This wasn't until 3 years later in 2002 whenever the Germans decided they wanted to get their stuff back for some reason, but Anyway, the Nebra Sky Disk is in good hands now. Silphium was a plant native to the Sumerian region in North Africa that had more uses than pretty much any plant ever. It became the entire backbone of that region's economy because of its great versatility and the demand for it. Now this demand was like Greek and Roman centered. They really loved this thing. It was used as a forage for goats and sheep. Its stems were roasted and eaten by humans. Its roots were eaten with vinegar by humans. It had medicinal uses, and its sap was the most popular condiment in the entire Hellenistic world. It was used to treat sore throats, fevers, warts, stomach aches, hernias. I mean, literally everything. How does a hernia in the same category as a sore throat as far as medicine goes? I don't know, but anyway, this stuff was like a miracle plant. Somehow it was even used as a contraceptive and as a perfume, and now that's just weird. This plant was basically the greatest thing ever until humans had to go and ruin it, because of course we did. The thing is, Silphium only grew in the Sumerian region of Africa. Literally a 125 by 35 mile strip of land is the only place on the planet they could get it to grow normally. No matter what the Greeks and Romans tried, they could not figure out how to farm it, and they were pretty good at farming. As a matter of fact, the Africans couldn't even farm it. They had to let it grow as a weed and then harvest it like that. They couldn't even make it grow in a farm. As you might imagine, this over-harvesting of a wild plant did not end well for the wild plant. Within only 100 years of its discovery, Silphium went all but extinct. To this day, no Silphium can be positively identified. The closest visual representation we have is the giant fennel, but it's not likely that it was actually the same plant because it's just not the same. The most likely explanation as to what Silphium actually was is a hybrid between two plants. And if it was a hybrid between two plants, then the first generation of the cross between the plants would not be the same as the second generation. This would explain why it couldn't be farmed. So far as genetics go, the first generation cross between two different plants has what's known as hybrid vigor. This normally means that it has the best characteristics of both plants. It's very desirable. It has very good hardiness. It's going to survive. But the second generation, which is a cross between two of the first generation hybrids, is not the same at all. Genetics get weird, and these second generation crosses are totally different. Like I said, this would explain why Silphium couldn't be farmed. The seed plants that they tried to farm with grew up as second generation crosses, which are, not desirable. They're not the same as the first gen hybrid vigor crosses. Sorry about the rant. I kind of like genetics. I have a bachelor's in agriculture, so that's one of my hyperfixations. But anyway, let's go to the next one. The stone spheres of Costa Rica are a collection of over 300 man-made stone spheres that were sculpted by the people of the Dagger culture from the Costa Rica area. They were made in roughly 500 to 1500 AD, and they range in size from handheld all the way to 6 foot in diameter. They were mostly formed from igneous rocks of the area using stone tools of that time. The most common theory as to why they were placed where they were placed is that they were placed in lines leading up to the village leaders' homes. Another theory as to why they were created and what they symbolize is that they symbolize the center of the universe and the creation of the universe as the Dagger people saw it, but the exact meaning behind these things will probably never be known. Funny story, these things were actually found by workers clearing the rainforest for use as a banana plantation. They literally just pushed them out of the way with their bulldozers, which destroyed no telling how many of them. They made it worse by circulating rumors that there was gold in the middle of these stones. So what do you think blue collar workers are going to do? Blue collar workers are going to take a pickaxe and dynamite, and they're going to get to the center of those stones to find that gold. And I can hate on blue collar guys because I am one, so... Back to the banana plantations, I highly suggest you watch Wendigoon's video covering the banana farms of South America. It will literally show you that these people are evil. But that's pretty much it for the stone spheres. Tutankhamun's iron dagger refers to a special dagger that was found in King Tut's tomb that contained such a high concentration of nickel that people thought that it was probably smelted from meteoric material. It contained mostly iron as is usual, but it contained 11% nickel and 0.6% cobalt. This puts its composition well within the range of every meteorite found ever. Alright, so King Tut was mummified in 1323 BC, but the smelting of iron wasn't really discovered until 1200 BC. This would put the dagger in a really weird position. If it was created in Egypt, then it was probably cold cut from the meteorite material and then just polished up, because the smelting of iron in Egypt doesn't have records of actually happening until 600 BC. So somebody probably just cut this metal out of a meteorite and then just shined it up, made a dagger for him, right? Well, maybe not. There's another theory out there. Scholars say that this thing was never heated to the point of smelting, so we got that part right, but it's also said that it wasn't just strictly cold cut either. They say that it was heated lightly so it could be formed, and it was also inlaid with gold and lapis lazuli and other stuff to make it look pretty. Then the dagger was probably gifted to King Tut's grandfather by the king of Mitanni, because ancient Egyptian records show that this guy gave this other guy this dagger as a wedding gift. It's some pretty cool lore, but it wasn't like there was actually smelting before the time of smelting. What were the Vimanas? Vimanas are often thought of as mysterious flying chariots, floating cities, or even celestial aircraft. These were common entities in Hindu and Sanskrit texts that were said to be able to travel in space, fly in the sky, and even navigate through water. Many of these depictions, no matter whether it was like a car or a house or a chariot or what it was depicted to be 7 stories high for some reason. Here are a couple examples from Hindu stories. Ravana was a king and a brother to a god, and he had a flying chariot, Vimana. A crystalline chariot that wandered the skies and the stars was owned by somebody named Vasu. I thought I was going to find more examples of these, and I probably would have if I would have been more ingrained in that culture, but anyway, the question remains, what really were these things if they were real? Well, to be honest, they probably weren't real, but if they were one of 2 things. Number 1, either ancient India had advanced aerial technology that was completely lost to time nowadays, or number 2 is my favorite. Aliens visited ancient India and they inspired all of these stories, as well as the rudimentary blueprints for flying machines that the Indians had, because these things are actually very close to what we have today as aircraft. I don't know. Sounds very possible. Baghdad Battery refers to a battery device that was found southeast of Baghdad, Iraq, and it was probably created between the years of 150 BC and 650 AD. The battery was composed of a ceramic pot, a copper tube, and an iron rod. Now when this thing is assembled, which means that the copper tube is inside the ceramic pot and the iron rod is through the copper tube, and an electrolytic solution fills the rest of the pot, it will create about 1.1 volt of electricity. Now while it's not confirmed that this thing was actually used as a battery, it probably was because it works perfectly. The ancient Iraqis used a method called electroplating to stick sheets of metal together, such as like gold to silver, and it used electricity, obviously. It was electroplating. This would have been perfect for this. They could have also used small amounts of electricity in something called electrotherapy to, you know, help pain and stuff like that, and this thing would have worked really well for that as well. It's low voltage, which is what you need. The sad part about this is that it completely disappeared off the face of the earth in 2003 during the USA's invasion of Iraq. So further testing on this thing will have to be done on models, so we'll never actually recreate the original thing. We'll never really know if it was actually used as a battery or if it was just a coincidence that using an electrolytic solution it could produce electricity. The Joseph Smith Papyri was a collection of Egyptian funerary papyri that was sold to Joseph Smith in Ohio, of all places. He claimed that these 2 Egyptian texts were the Book of Abraham and the Book of Joseph, and he worked for a long time to translate the Book of Abraham. He worked on the Book of Joseph as well, but he never finished it. Here's the thing, he claimed that this Book of Abraham that he translated was an inspired writing that detailed the life of the biblical figure Abraham. If you don't know what an inspired writing is, it's basically when God works through you to write something, like the Gospels. Well, as it turns out, this Book of Abraham translates to the Horror Book of Breathing, which detailed the Egyptian funerary breathing rites. I don't know, it's not at all biblical. It was actually the navigation of the afterlife in Egypt, which anyway, that's still not the same at all. It had absolutely nothing to do with Christianity, and the same goes for the Book of Joseph. The Book of Joseph was a funerary scroll written for an Egyptian woman. Basically, everything Joseph Smith said about these books was a complete and total lie. It was likely that he lied about this stuff being inspired writing so that he could advance his Latter-day Saints church. Makes you wonder what else he lied about. As to where the papyri are today, they both ended up in the museum in Chicago after Joseph's death. The Great Chicago Fire ended up destroying almost everything in that museum, but there are fragments of these scrolls left. Since we can actually translate Egyptian, we can read these fragments now and say that everything he said about at least these scripts were a complete and total lie. The Olmec colossal heads are a group of 17 giant heads that were carved in Mexico that were probably from the Olmec civilization. The heads are anywhere from 4 to 11 feet tall and up to 25 tons in weight. They're basically just big stones with humanoid faces carved in them. They have very flat noses, puffy cheeks, and headdresses with like unique emblems carved into them. It's been theorized that these stones were the carved heads of the leaders of the Olmec people, and that would make sense as to why there's not that many of them, and they're all unique in their emblems. Well, I don't know about you, but I previously knew absolutely nothing about the Olmec people, so here's a little bit about them. They were supposedly one of the original ancient civilizations, kind of like the Indus Valley civilization and the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and those kind. It developed in Mesoamerica, which was like the southern part of Mexico and Central America. This was basically the rainforest, so it was a totally different type of civilization from the Mesopotamians. Of the 17 heads that were found, 10 of them were found in San Lorenzo, and and 4 of them were found in Labyrinth, and both of these cities served as like the cultural hubs for the Olmec people. Now I'm a little bit wrong. The Olmec people lived from like 1200 BC to 400 BC, so they weren't nearly as ancient as like the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, but they were some of the earliest people in that area. These heads were thought to have been carved in the early days of the Olmec people, because by about 900 BC, these things were all buried seemingly. To be honest, not that much is known about the Olmec people, and I've already told you basically everything we know about the colossal heads. So I guess it's just one of those ancient mysteries for a reason. The Lost Labyrinth of Egypt is a buried complex under the Hawara Pyramid in Egypt. It's said that it held tons of structures that would have told us a lot about ancient Egyptian culture. It was said to have libraries, galleries, temples, funerary complexes, and pretty much anything you can think of, because it had over 3,000 rooms. Herodotus said that this thing was an actual labyrinth, and that means a lot coming from him because he actually traveled to Egypt and saw it. Apparently there was about 300,000 square feet of labyrinth. If you're not good at relating things in size, that's insane. A decent sized house is about 2,000 square feet, so if you put 1,500 houses together, then you're gonna have the labyrinth. That's insane. Anyway, this thing was built in roughly 1800 BC by Amenemhat III and later expanded on by his daughter Soben-Neferu. Multiple Greek and Roman scholars say that this thing was magnificent, and it was a wonder in itself. It was as great and magnificent as the pyramids. One guy goes as far as to say that this labyrinth is what inspired Daedalus to create the labyrinth for King Minos. If you don't know what that one was, it was the Crete labyrinth that had the Minotaur in it. Now that labyrinth is probably all just a story, but this thing had so much impact that it actually created, labyrinth stories like that. That's crazy. The Tollund Man and other bog bodies refers to a man found mummified in a peat bog in Denmark that was preserved so well that we know what he had to eat last. The man's body was found in 1950, but it's estimated that he actually died in 400 BC. Get this, the acidic and oxygen-free environment of the peat bog preserved this man's body so well that the people that found him thought he was a recent murder victim. In all actuality, he died 2,500 years ago. Now that's crazy. Anyway, his cause of death was said to be by hanging, and while he definitely could have just been executed for his crimes or whatever, he had a peaceful expression on his face. This peaceful expression leads a lot of people to believe that he was actually sacrificed as part of some ritual that they had going on. The last thing in his stomach was a porridge consisting of barley, flax, some seeds, and fish. So he was eating good. Now as for the other bog bodies part of this deal, there were over 500 bog bodies found in similar peat bogs across Europe. These other bodies found date back all the way to 8000 BC, all the way up to like World War II as their time of death. Each bog varies in its acidity, its oxygen level, and its temperature, so literally every body that was found is at a varying degree of decomposition. Lots of these bodies are like the Tollund Man in that they were probably sacrificed instead of just executed for their crimes. Like I said, the oldest bog body found dates all the way back to 8000 BC, and he probably died at about 20 years old. I'll leave you with this one, the Lindau Man. He was found in the Lindau Moss Peat Bog in England, and it's said that he probably died in the 1st century AD. His cause of death was said to be inconclusive because he had 3 possible causes of death. He had a bashed in skull, a slit throat, and strangulation marks on his neck. This poor man had it rough. The mystery of the Varna Gold. This refers to 13 pounds of gold in various forms like beads and golden bulls and necklaces, stuff like that was found in the Varna necropolis in Bulgaria. The Varna culture dates back to 4600 BC all the way to 4200 BC, which is still 3,000 years before the Olmec civilization we just talked about. The gold dates back to every bit as old as the civilization, so that's seriously impressive. This means that the Varna people were molding gold into these figures all the way back in 4600 BC, which is before any other civilization ever. Alright, so far as the necropolis goes, it had 312 graves, and one giant thing stood out to researchers. Basically every grave had a flint knife or a bone bracelet or maybe even a bead of gold, but very few had large pieces of gold. Just 4 of the 312 graves found contained 3/4 of all the gold found in the entire Varna necropolis. Obviously, this points to them being the leaders or the most wealthy people in the Varna culture. This has proven that these people were pretty much the first in all of history to have a complex society with different levels of wealth and status. It's likely that these people that had gold were the first people that learned how to work with metal so they could form gold into whatever they needed it to be. Obviously, metal couldn't break, and if it did, you needed a metal worker to form it back into a tool or whatever you were using it for. So that's why metalworkers were probably on top. Anyway, the Varna Gold tells us a lot about ancient civilizations, even if it was 6,500 years ago. Where did the Sumerians come from? Alright, so the Sumerians were the OG settlers of ancient Mesopotamia, obviously settling between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They first settled here anywhere from the years like 5500 BC to 4500 BC, but the question remains, where did they come from to settle here? Well, the earliest known settlers of the area were the Ubaid people. They had towns, pottery, cattle farms, basically just a full functioning society. It's theorized that these people simply started nearby and then they migrated a little bit over to where the Sumerians really thrived, and they just morphed into what the Sumerians were known as whenever they were in full force. Another prominent theory is that the Sumerians actually came from North Africa and they settled in the Mesopotamian area because of its fertility. This theory gets heavily criticized because it's basically based on the assumption that farming actually originated in North Africa, which challenges the narrative that farming actually originated in Mesopotamia itself. Another theory says that Dilmun is the home city of the Sumerians. Dilmun is mentioned often in ancient Sumerian texts, saying that it actually was their homeland and it was located on the island of Bahrain. This is actually a valid theory because there's proof that there was a civilization there at one time, but it's unknown whether or not that was the Sumerians' home base. The last thing I'll say is this: the Sumerian language is a completely isolated language, meaning that there's no languages that relate to it before or after the Sumerian language itself. If we had literally any other languages to link to the Sumerians, we could find out more about these people, but as it stands, we just really don't know. My best guess is that they did come from the Ubaid people, but let me know what you think down below. The Carnac Stones are a group of over 3,000 prehistoric stones that are arranged in rows over a kilometer long. Now in freedom units, that's like 3,800 feet or about 3/4 of a mile. At the ends of the rows of these things are circular patterns of stones. They're located near Brittany, France, and they range in their date from 4,500 BC to about 3,300 BC. If you remember, Stonehenge was created around 3000 BC, so these people were ahead of the curve. Now these people were probably the pre-Celtic people of the area that were hunter-gatherers, unlike the agrarian society that built Stonehenge. Now these stones range in height from about 13 feet tall all the way down to like 2 feet tall, and they were arranged in their rows from shortest to tallest or vice versa. Aside from the stone rows, we also have these circular patterns of stones that we already talked about, and we also have tumuli, which are burial mounds over graves. There are also dolmens, which is like 2 or more stones standing with a stone on the top of it that are over a grave as well. So what is actually the purpose of this random huge array of stones? Well, to be completely honest, I don't know. Most people think they probably have something to do with ancient astronomy. They might have been used to track the sun, moon, stars, solstices, and so on and so forth. They might have been used as rudimentary calendars to predict like the day of the year because of the stars and sun and stuff like that. I don't know. It probably is some sort of astronomical arrangement that these ancient people had figured out, but there's another theory that I actually like more. One day, a legion of Roman soldiers was marching through this field, and the wizard Merlin turned them to stone. It makes sense. Kofun refers to tumuli, which we literally just defined as burial mounds from the Kofun period in Japan. This period was from roughly 3rd century to 7th century AD. Now they do vary in size, but a lot of the time they are giant burial mound arrangements, sometimes spanning like hundreds of meters across and with moats surrounding them. So you know they were for the elites of society. Now there are several different shapes of these Kofun, from like square to circular to conjoined rectangle, but there's one that's even more popular. That title belongs to the keyhole-shaped Kofun. These are ridiculously cool looking and impressive works of art. Now the tombs themselves were most of the time nothing special. They had a coffin and they had grave goods. But from the grave goods we can actually tell how wealthy a lot of these people were. Iron weapons, bronze mirrors, fancy jade jewelry, and a whole bunch of other stuff tells us that some of these people really were wealthy. There was also a special type of pottery among the grave goods known as haniwa. This was typically a cylindrical amount of clay that was cut into like houses, animals, different figures, geometric amalgamations, different stuff like that. Roopkund is a mysterious lake at the high altitude of 16,470 feet in the Indian Himalayas. Now Roopkund is also known as Skeleton Lake because when the snow melts every year, there are over 200 human skeletons found at the base of the lake. They were originally found in 1942 by a park ranger, and you remember what big huge world event was going on in 1942, right? That's right. World War II. When they were found, the British authorities that still ruled India thought that it might be a Japanese invasion force that tried to get in through the Himalayan mountains, and that would have caused a massive panic. As it turns out, these skeletons were actually from 800 AD all the way up to 1800 AD, but you know, they were not new enough to be a Japanese invasion force. Now there seemed to be two distinct groups of people that met their end by the lake. You know, 800 AD and 1800 AD are 1,000 years apart after all. One group appeared to be pilgrims, men, women, and children that met their end at the lake because of a giant hailstorm that passed overhead. There's no cover by the lake, so the heavy hail bashed them in the head to death. It must have been an awful hailstorm. Hopefully it was a hailstorm, because if it wasn't, it was probably some sort of group sacrifice, kind of like Jonestown, so you know, hopefully it was a hailstorm. These days Roopkund is a very popular tourist attraction, you know, hikers and such, so hopefully no new groups of dead skeletons show up anytime soon. The Sivatherium of Kish is an ancient giraffe-like extinct species that shows up on a copper rain ring from the city-state Kish, which was from Sumeria. Alright, so first off, the Sivatherium was an ancient giraffe-like creature that roamed the continents of Eurasia and Africa in prehistoric times. It was about 10 feet tall at its head, so it was a lot shorter than a giraffe, but it was super beefy. It weighed about 3,000 pounds. For reference, there's a large breed of cattle known as Brahmins, and at full size, Brahmin bulls grow to only 2,400 pounds. So that's insane to be 3,000 pounds. This was basically a really tall bovine species that was spotted up like a giraffe with antlers like a moose. Honestly, it's one of the coolest things I've ever heard of in my entire life. Anyway, they supposedly died out about 1,000,000 years ago, but if the ancient Sumerians knew enough about them to draw them and to mold them into a copper rain ring, then that says that's probably not true. Turns out there's also cave paintings in the Sahara Desert and in India of Sivatheriums that accurately depict them as soon as 8,000 years ago. Just based on these drawings, the Sumerians could have enough knowledge to draw these things out, but probably not enough to get so accurate with their little rain ring. One theory says that these things probably existed alongside Sumerians, and they used them as basically oxen to pull their chariots and wagons and stuff. Another theory says that these things still exist to this day, but they live in such isolated groups that nobody has seen them since the Sumerian days. I absolutely love these things now because they're just so cool. They basically become a modern day cryptid because nobody's seen them in so long, but still, these things are awesome. What is actually inside Qin Shi Huang's tomb? Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of China, and he reigned from about 259 BC to 210 BC. He had a mausoleum or tomb built under a pyramid-shaped burial mound in the city of Qian. This mausoleum was said to have taken 38 years to build, so you know it's just a massive work of art. It is apparently 22 square miles of underground burial complex, which is absolutely insane to think about. Thing is, it still hasn't been excavated to this day. What we do know is that there's a collection of life-size terracotta figures known as the Terracotta Army that were found guarding the main mausoleum. Oh yeah, did I mention there's 8,000 of these things? Like everything else about this mausoleum, this is insane. The discovery of these figures is partially why the rest of the mausoleum has not been excavated yet. Within just 4 minutes of exposure to the outside area, the paint on these terracotta figures begins to dry out and flake off. Serious measures will have to be taken to excavate the rest of the tomb because we don't want to tear anything up. Anyway, what else might be in there? Well, the Chinese historian Sima Qian says that there are streams and pools of flowing mercury, there are precious metals and gold, stones, trees of jade, birds of gold and steel, literally anything you can think of, it's probably in there. It's basically described as being as close to heaven as they knew of back in that day. Flowing rivers of mercury would be super cool, except for the fact that this emperor probably died because of his consumption of mercury. Now, why was he consuming mercury? Well, the ancient Chinese thought that mercury was a life-giving elixir, so he was taking a little bit of it here and there, and it led to mercury poisoning. And that's probably what killed him. Anyway, give me some speculation. Let me know what you think might be in that tomb down below. What was the Set animal? The Set animal was an animal depicted either with or as the Egyptian god Set in hieroglyphs. Usual depictions show this animal as some type of canine. It looked like it could be a greyhound, fox, jackal, or something completely different. We really don't know. Some people think it could even be an aardvark because of its long curved snout. Some people think that it could be an antelope, which I really don't think could be possible. I don't think it's an antelope. But anyway, the most likely explanation is that it was either an amalgamation of a bunch of different of these animals, or it was an extinct animal that we don't even know of. The only other explanation that I think could be possible is that it was a Saluki, or a Persian hound. This dog looks nearly identical to the hieroglyph of the said animal, so I think it really could be possible. We know that the Egyptians knew of the Saluki because the Saluki was represented in other hieroglyphs. So honestly, aside from an amalgamation or extinct animal that we don't know about, the Saluki is probably the most likely explanation to what the said animal really was. Alright, so we covered a ton of ancient mysteries in this video, so check out this video on screen that's going to cover a ton more. I'm personally going to go translate some Egyptian texts and start my own religion. Peace.